Hey everyone, how's it going? Now, I don't know if you've heard, but there's been a bit of a kerfuffle with a big balloon from China flying over the United States. Now, personally, I don't really think this balloon was all that big of a deal, and the military didn't seem to think it was that big of a deal either, seeing as how they knew it was flying off the Aleutian Islands and basically decided to ignore it, and only decided to take action once people knew about it. But still, the balloon threw a bunch of people into a bit of a frenzy, thinking it was a weapon of some kind, so I figured what better time than now to talk about some balloon-based weaponry. I should also mention that as of me writing the script, two more objects were shot down in Alaska and Canada. They haven't said what they were yet, but I would assume they're more balloons. But anyway, we'll be taking a look at three different balloon weapons, one that failed, one that succeeded, and one that was hypothetically useful but was never used in combat. We'll start with the most infamous one, the one that failed. These are the Fugo balloon bombs. These balloons, which were Japan's attempt to firebomb the continental United States during World War II, originated back in the early 1930s with a man named Reikichi Tada. He would design 13-foot hydrogen balloons that would be able to travel around 70 miles, before a timed fuse dropped an explosive payload. The project would be halted shortly after and would lay dormant for nearly a decade until 1942. In April of that year, America would bomb Tokyo in what was known as the Doolittle Raid. While this raid would do relatively little in damage, it was still a major propaganda victory for the United States, and it infuriated the Japanese government. This led Japan to create several test bombing programs where Japan would try to cause chaos on the United States West Coast. The only one of these initial programs that made any kind of mark was one where some seaplanes launched from a submarine would firebomb a forest in Oregon. Even still, this attack did very little damage as U.S. forces, aka firefighters, spotted the plane and successfully contained the fires. Later on, in September 1942, with the other programs not accomplishing much, the Fugo project was revived and expanded. The original 70-mile range of the balloons would be increased almost ninefold to 600 miles, with the intent that the balloons would be launched from submarines off the United States West Coast. However, as these submarines were needed for more conventional warfare and for general food transportation, the range would be increased another tenfold to 6,000 miles, with the intent of launching them from the Japanese mainland. They would achieve this through a combination of the forces of nature and a complex system of fuses, gas valves, sandbags, altimeters, and explosives. The balloons, launched from Japan in the wintertime for a more optimal jet stream, would float up into the jet stream, which was between 30,000 and 35,000 feet in the air, and would ride over to the US in anywhere between 30 and 100 hours, depending on how the jet stream was. The gas valve and sandbags would help keep the balloons at a stable enough height to keep them in the jet stream. If the balloon went too high, the valve would activate and release some of the hydrogen gas in the balloon. If it went too low, or between around 25,000 and 27,000 feet, a set of altimeters would trigger the release of a sandbag, lowering the overall payload and allowing the balloon to rise back up into the jet stream. Eventually, as the balloon would cycle back and forth through this process, it would end up falling to somewhere between 13,000 and 20,000 feet, where another set of altimeters would activate a 1-hour fuse that would trigger the bombs. After the bombs were dropped, a 3-minute fuse would trigger and destroy the carriage that held everything under the balloon, and after that, another fuse that was 82 minutes would trigger and destroy the balloon itself. Given that they had to rely on the jet stream and this complex system of fuses and altimeters, the Japanese military only expected about 10% of the balloons launched to actually reach the continental United States. For their overall design, there would be two distinct balloon types. Early Type A balloons were made of several layers of washi paper that Japanese schoolgirls helped glue together for some fun arts and crafts. The other Type B balloons were much more durable and were made from rubberized silk. The balloons would be 33 feet in diameter and could lift up to 300 pounds. The first of these balloons would be launched on November 3rd, 1944, from several stations on the main Japanese island of Honshu. Each balloon took about 30 minutes to an hour to actually launch, so with the combined power of the several launching stations, they could launch upwards of 200 balloons per day. By the time the program ended in April 1944, as winter was over and the more optimal jet stream was gone, some 9,300 balloons would be launched. From the period of November 1944 to April 1945, a multitude of sightings would reach the U.S. government, and somewhere around 300 reported balloon incidents would be reported. The balloons were mostly concentrated around the Pacific Northwest, but would travel as far east as Michigan and as far south as Texas. Even with all these balloons reaching the U.S., they still ended up doing basically nothing. There was effectively no reported damage, in large part because the U.S. government requested to news agencies that they keep quiet about the balloon sightings so as to not give the Japanese any information, and the news agencies would oblige, so none of the balloon incidents were reported apart from two specific ones. One balloon on March 10, 1945, would manage to short-circuit some power lines in Washington state, and it just so happened that these lines were powering a Manhattan Project facility. It would take 3 whole days for full power to be restored to the facility. The other incident, on May 5, 1945, occurred when a family of 7 found a downed balloon in Bly, Oregon. The balloon's payload did not detonate, and presumably one of the family members decided to tamper with it and caused it to detonate, killing 6 of them. The US government would allow this story to be printed so people knew not to mess with any downed balloons they found out in the wilderness. Overall, Fugo was a failure. It didn't really accomplish anything, so let's move on to a project that was actually pretty effective in Operation Outward. This was a British program using balloons to bomb and generally disrupt Germany. Interestingly, the project was born out of an accident in September 1940, when barrage balloons, which raise steel cables around specific objects to help protect it from approaching enemy aircraft, broke free due to strong winds. The balloons trailing these large steel cables would drift all the way over to Denmark and Sweden, where the trailing cables would damage vital infrastructure like power lines, railroads, and radio antenna. Because these balloons would display rather remarkable destructive potential for what they were, Winston Churchill called for the Air Ministry to look into using balloons as weapons, and while the Air Ministry disliked the idea, the British Navy did like the idea, and they also found that the winds where the balloons would travel typically go from west to east, meaning that the British could attack the Germans with them, but not the other way around. While the Air Ministry was concerned that these balloons, which were initially to be made out of latex rubber, would waste too much rubber, a very vital resource, the Navy already had a very large surplus of weather balloons 100,000 strong, all stored in talcum powder to help maintain their durability. About a year later, in September 1941, the British Chiefs of Staff officially gave the project the green light to launch, and on May 20th, 1942, the first balloons would be released in southeast Britain. These balloons were remarkably more simple than their Japanese counterpart. The mechanism for controlling the balloon's altitude and payload was a combination of a cord, a slow-burning fuse, and a can of mineral oil. On launch, the fuse would be lit and the balloon would rapidly rise to around 25,000 feet, where the natural expansion of the balloon caused by the decrease in external pressure at high altitudes would trigger a cord to release some of the gas in the balloon. From there, the balloon would ride the wind and slowly leak gas, lowering its altitude. Eventually, the lit fuse reached a can of mineral oil and burned away a little stopper, which allowed the oil to begin leaking from the can. This would decrease the payload. This combination of leaking gas from the balloon and leaking oil from the can would help keep the balloon at a relatively stable height. Eventually, the fuse would reach the payload and would activate it. More than half of the nearly 100,000 balloons launched used a wire payload, somewhat similar to what happened in 1940. The fuse would trigger the release of a 700-foot hemp cord that was attached to a 300-foot 15-gauge steel wire, which was only about 1.8 millimeters in diameter. The intent for these was that the wire would drag across the ground and eventually would connect to a power line in Germany, causing it to short out. The other three most common payloads were simply known as beer, jelly, and socks, all incendiary payloads. Beer was a canister filled with small white phosphorus grenades. Jelly was a canister of incendiary jelly, and socks were V-shaped bundles of canvas soaked in paraffin wax. These were V-shaped, so when dropped, they could catch onto tree branches and start forest fires. After about 2 years or so, the balloon program would begin to slow down in early 1944 as Allied forces were making pretty significant headway in Europe, and they didn't want the balloons to interfere with Allied forces, and the program would eventually end in September 1944. All said and done, the program was highly effective in that it forced the Luftwaffe to try and intervene and destroy the balloons, making the Germans waste a great deal of aircraft fuel. Additionally, the wire balloons caused at least an estimated 1.5 million British pounds worth of damage to German infrastructure, and considering that each balloon only cost 35 shillings, or 1.75 pounds, the balloons were absolutely worth it from a monetary standpoint alone. While the incendiary balloons certainly caused some havoc and fires, the actual effect they had is basically unknown, as the reported fires technically could have occurred from other means. Still, Outward was a major success and serves as an example of balloon warfare done right. The last project that we'll briefly go over, as it was a very small project that never saw use, was a United States project called the E77 balloon bomb. This Cold War-era weapon began development in 1950 as a biological weapon, or technically, a strategic weapon. E77 was considered an anti-crop weapon. The balloon's payload would deliver a large amount of lightweight objects, and when the payload was activated, these objects would gently float down over their target. In this case, they would use something like feathers. The feathers were coated with spores of various diseases that negatively impacted plants, things like wheat stem rust. The feathers would spread these diseases to the enemy country's crops, reducing their food production and basically starving them out. While the testing of E77 showed that it was rather effective at spreading diseases on crops, testing and advancement on more traditional aircraft-launched bomb payloads that could carry such biological weapons meant that the use of balloons for dispersing disease was very outdated. As a result, E77 would later be cancelled, thus ending the prospect of a biological balloon bomb. And so, with the two projects that would actually see combat use, I think we can really see how balloon weapons can be effective. They seem to be good for short-range, country-to-country, cheap scattershot attacks. The launching of a few hundred balloons can cause damage all across a nearby country at basically no cost to the user, considering how expensive war can be. Imagine, if you will, a giant shotgun in space pointing at a country. Of course, the greater the distance between the two countries, the further back that hypothetical shotgun would be, significantly reducing the actual damage it could do to its target country. In Japan's case, this hypothetical shotgun was really far away. In Britain's case, it was basically at point-blank range, and in E77's case, the analogy doesn't really apply anymore. And so, with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So, thank you all for watching. With the current balloon situation going on, I'm kind of curious if the other objects shot down were balloons as well. I would assume that they were. I feel like this time around, when they spotted these new objects, they just decided they didn't want the whole controversy again, and decided to destroy it so people wouldn't complain about it. Kind of weird times we live in, people freaking out about balloons. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, I hope you tune in for my next one, and I hope you learned something from this one. So, see ya!